The notice was nailed to the post of Nelson Sheridan's front gate on a Tuesday morning in the spring of 1882, and when he read it, the coffee mug in his hand cracked clean in two from the force of his grip. He had built this ranch with his bare hands. Every plank of the fence, every stone in the fireplace, every acre of cleared pasture had been earned through 12 years of brutal, honest work, and now a single sheet of paper with an official wax seal claimed that it belonged to someone else. He stood there in the early light of an Arizona morning, the red dust of the canyon country settling around his boots, the distant sound of cattle lowing in the lower pasture, and he read the words again because surely he had misread them the first time. He had not misread them. The notice bore the name of one Gerald Morrow, land speculator, recently arrived from St. Louis with a briefcase full of purchased documents and a lawyer who wore his suits too clean for the frontier. According to the paper, Morrow held the deed to the land now registered as Sheridan's Creek Ranch, consisting of 412 acres along the western bank of the Morales River in the territory of Arizona. According to the paper, Nelson Sheridan had 7 days to vacate the premises and remove his livestock and possessions before the law would act on his behalf. 7 days. Nelson let what remained of the coffee mug fall to the dirt. He was 34 years old, a lean and sun-darkened man with broad shoulders, dark eyes the color of creek water in shade, and hands that told the story of every year he had lived in this territory. He had come to Arizona at 22 with nothing but a horse, a bedroll, a small leather purse of wages he had saved from driving cattle up through Texas, and a stubborn belief that a man could build something worth keeping if he was willing to put in the kind of work that other men walked away from. He had not walked away, not once. Not even in the hard winter of 1875, when the river froze and 2 of his 3 horses died, and he ate boiled leather for the better part of a week before the thaw came. Not even when the Apache troubles pushed half the ranchers in the territory north toward Tucson and the government sent soldiers who trampled his fences and took his grain without payment. Not even when the drought of 1879 burned half his pasture to chalk and he spent 18 months rebuilding what the sun had taken. This was his land. He knew every rise and hollow of it the way a man knows the face of someone he loves. He walked back to the house, sat down at his oak table, and spread the document flat with both palms. He read it slowly, the way his father had taught him to read any contract word by word, sentence by sentence, looking for the truth beneath the language. What he found, when he read carefully, was that Gerald Morrow's claim rested on a deed that predated the one Nelson held. Morrow's deed was dated 1869, registered in the Territorial Land Office in Prescott. Nelson's deed was dated 1872, also registered in Prescott. But Nelson had begun building the ranch in 1870. He had plowed the first field in 1870. He had registered a homestead claim in 1870. There was something wrong with Morrow's documentation. Nelson could feel it in his bones the way he could feel a change in weather. The question was whether any man in Calico Bend, the nearest town, had the legal knowledge to prove it before sundown on the 7th day. He saddled his horse within the hour. Calico Bend sat in a wide flat basin between 2 ridges of red rock, a town of perhaps 300 people that had grown up around the stage stop and the copper mine that had since gone quiet, leaving behind a collection of weathered storefronts, a hotel, 2 saloons, a general store, a church that doubled as a schoolhouse, and a small land office that also served as the unofficial court when Judge Pratt came through on his quarterly circuit. It was a town that smelled of dust and horse and wood smoke, and it was the only town within a day's ride in any direction. Nelson came in from the North Road, his horse picking its way along the rutted Main Street at a trot. He was headed for the land office, because he knew that was where the records were kept, and because he knew that Hiram Calley, who ran the land office, was a man who cared about accuracy even when accuracy was inconvenient. Hiram was 60 years old, half deaf in his left ear, and possessed of a meticulous mind that had once prevented a timber company from stealing 9,000 acres of federal grazing land through a forged survey. Nelson trusted him. But when he pushed open the door of the land office, it was not Hiram Calley standing at the counter. It was a woman. She was perhaps 28 or 29, tall for a woman, with a posture that suggested she had never once in her life been told to make herself smaller. Her hair was dark brown, pinned up in a practical way, and she wore a deep blue traveling dress that was road-dusted at the hem, which told him she had arrived recently. She had intelligent gray eyes and a mouth that was set with a firm kind of determination, and she was bent over a large leather-bound registry book with a magnifying glass in one hand and a pencil in the other. She did not look up when he came in. "I will be with you in a moment," she said, in the clear, unhurried voice of a woman who was entirely accustomed to finishing what she had started before attending to interruptions. Nelson stood at the counter and waited, which was not something he was particularly good at. After what felt like 3 full minutes, she straightened, set down her magnifying glass with precise care, and looked at him. "You are here about the Sheridan Creek Ranch," she said. It was not a question. Nelson blinked. "How did you know that?" "Because you are the third person this morning to come through that door looking like the ground has been pulled out from under them," she said. "And because you have the look of a man who has been outside in the sun for the last 10 years, which means you are either a cattle rancher or a surveyor, and no surveyor in the territory would wear that particular expression over a land dispute unless it was his own land. Hiram left me his records when he took ill last week. I have been reviewing them for the past 3 days, and the Morrow claim is the most concerning thing I have seen." She paused. "I am Letitia Bristol. I am an attorney." Nelson stared at her for a moment. A woman attorney. She met his gaze without a flicker of apology. "Yes, I graduated from the University of Michigan Law School 2 years ago. I was admitted to the Michigan Bar, and I was admitted to the Arizona Territorial Bar 6 months ago, which makes my standing here entirely legal, regardless of what your expression is currently suggesting." A very faint trace of amusement crossed her features. "I take it you are Nelson Sheridan." "I am." "Then sit down, Mr. Sheridan, and show me what they gave you, because from what I have found in these records, Gerald Morrow has filed 3 similar claims in the past 18 months across 3 different counties, and every single one of them relies on a deed that I believe was fraudulently obtained." Nelson pulled the notice from his coat pocket and laid it on the counter. He remained standing, because sitting felt like giving something up, and he was not in the habit of giving things up. Letitia took the notice, smoothed it, and read it with the same focused intensity she had applied to the registry book. He watched her read it and found himself paying attention to things he had no particular business paying attention to, such as the precise way she tilted the paper toward the window light to read the smaller print, and the small vertical line that appeared between her brows when she reached a passage that troubled her. "This is worse than the others," she said quietly, almost to herself. Then she looked up at him. "Your homestead filing from 1870, do you have a copy of it?" "I have the original." "At the ranch. Good. I need you to ride back and get it. I also need any survey documents, any letters or records from the Territorial Land Office that reference your claim, any receipts for improvements made to the property, and any witnesses who can testify to your continuous presence on the land since 1870. Can you get all of that and be back here before 4 o'clock? It is 9:30 now. Which means you have 6.5 hours, and you live approximately an hour and a half out on the North Road, which gives you 3 hours at the ranch to gather documents." She was already reaching for a fresh sheet of paper. "I will spend that time preparing the counterclaim. I intend to file it before sundown today, because under territorial law, a counterclaim filed within 24 hours of the original notice suspends the eviction timeline and requires a formal hearing before a territorial judge." She paused, her pencil hovering. "Judge Pratt arrives in Calico Bend on Friday. That gives us 3 days to build a case." Nelson looked at this woman for a long moment. She was standing in a borrowed land office in a small Arizona town, with road dust on her hem and fire in her gray eyes, telling him with complete confidence that she was going to dismantle a fraudulent land grab before sundown on the day it had been filed. "Miss Bristol," he said carefully, "I appreciate your help, but I want to be clear that I cannot afford a great deal in the way of legal fees at the present time." She did not even pause. "I am not charging you for this particular case, Mr. Sheridan. I am charging Gerald Morrow's reputation." She looked at him steadily. 3 ranching families in Pima County lost their land to him last year. A widow in Cochise County lost a homestead her husband died building. I have been gathering evidence on his operation for 4 months. Your case may be the one I can prove in court, because your documentation is better than anyone else's, and because this territory is about to get a very clear message about what happens when a man in a fine suit tries to steal from people who have done nothing but work. She let that settle for a moment. "Now please ride, Mr. Sheridan. You are wasting light." He rode. The journey back to the ranch was faster than it should have been, because his horse could read his urgency, and because Nelson's mind was working at a speed that kept his body sharp. He went through the ranch at a controlled trot, tying his horse at the post and going directly to the iron strongbox beneath the floorboard of his bedroom, which was where he kept every legal document he owned. He had always been methodical about paperwork, which was an unusual trait in a man who had spent 12 years ranching alone, but his father had been a school teacher in Ohio before the war, and certain habits of precision had been drilled into Nelson early. He pulled out the homestead filing from 1870, the original survey conducted by government surveyor James Holt in the autumn of that year, 3 letters from the Territorial Land Office in Prescott acknowledging his registration, a deed from 1872 in his own name with the land office seal, and a bundled set of receipts for lumber, for cattle purchases, for seed, for fencing wire dating back to 1870, and spanning 12 years in a neat chronological order that his father would have approved of. He also went to find his neighbor, Ezra Goodnight, who ran a smaller cattle operation 2 miles east and who had been Nelson's nearest friend and occasional ranch hand since 1871. Ezra was 60 years old, built like a fence post, with a gray beard and eyes that had seen everything twice. When Nelson explained the situation in rapid sentences, Ezra swore with a creativity that Nelson had always quietly admired, then fetched his own hat and horse without being asked. "I have been here since you plowed the first field," Ezra said, falling in beside him on the road back toward Calico Bend. "I remember the day you staked the corners. I remember when there was nothing here but grass and a creek and your stubborn self. I will swear to that in front of any judge in any territory." They made it back to Calico Bend with 40 minutes to spare before 4 o'clock. Letitia was not alone when they arrived. She had acquired, in the intervening hours, a portable writing desk, 3 additional reference volumes of territorial law, and a young man named Tobias who ran errands for the hotel and had been drafted into the role of document courier with what appeared to be great enthusiasm. The counterclaim document was already drafted in Letitia's clear, even-hand, 6 pages of dense, precise legal argument that Nelson read while standing at the counter and found himself unable to fully follow but deeply impressed by. She took his documents with the focused efficiency of a field surgeon, working through each one with her magnifying glass, making notes in the margins of her own papers, pausing occasionally to ask him a precise question about dates or distances or the names of particular officials he had dealt with. She questioned Ezra as well, with the same precise attention, and Ezra answered everything without hesitation or elaboration, which was the ideal way to answer a lawyer's questions. At 5:30, with the Arizona sun still 2 hours from setting, Letitia Bristol straightened up from the counter, stacked the completed counterclaim into a clean folder tied with a red ribbon, and looked at Nelson with the expression of a woman who had just finished something important and well. "I am filing this now," she said. "Will you walk with me to the registrar's office?" The registrar's office was 3 doors down from the land office, and the registrar himself, a narrow-shouldered man named Clive Potter, who was already in the process of putting on his hat to go to supper, went visibly pale when Letitia placed the counterclaim on his desk and asked him to stamp and register it. "Miss Bristol," Clive said, with the careful tone of a man choosing his next words very slowly, "Mr. Morrow's attorney was in here this afternoon, and he made it quite clear." "I am sure he made many things quite clear," Letitia said pleasantly. "And I am making it equally clear that this is a duly prepared counterclaim under Arizona Territorial Statute, Article 14, Section 3, filed before the statutory sundown deadline. If you fail to register it, Mr. Potter, you will be in personal violation of territorial law, and I will be delighted to put that in writing for you." She smiled. "The stamp, please." Clive Potter stamped the document. Outside the registrar's office, in the long gold light of the Arizona evening, Nelson stood with Letitia on the wooden sidewalk and breathed in the smell of dust and coming night and the first cool air that drifted down from the ridge after sundown. The horses moved at the hitching rail. Somewhere down the street, a piano was playing in one of the saloons, a slightly off-key rendition of something that might have been a waltz. "It is filed," he said. "It is filed," she agreed. He looked at her. She looked straight ahead at the street, at the last light on the red rock ridges to the west, with an expression that was calm and settled, the expression of a woman who had done exactly what she set out to do. "I owe you more than I can say," he told her. She turned to look at him then, and something in her expression shifted, not much, just enough for him to see that underneath the professional composure she was tired, the good tired of real effort and something else that he could not quite name. "You do not owe me anything yet," she said. "We have not won. We have only bought ourselves 3 days and a hearing. Gerald Morrow will come back with his lawyer, and his lawyer is better than Clive Potter's willingness to be frightened." She paused. "Have you eaten?" "Because I have not, and I think best when I have eaten, and we need to discuss strategy." They ate at the hotel dining room, which served a decent beef stew and cornbread, and they talked about law for 90 minutes. Or rather, Letitia talked about law and Nelson listened and asked questions that she seemed surprised to find intelligent. She explained the structure of the case, the weakness in Morrow's deed, the chain of title issue that she believed she could expose if she could get the original territorial records sent from Prescott in time. She talked about precedent in similar cases, and about the particular way that Judge Pratt, who she had researched carefully, tended to weigh documentary evidence versus testimony. Nelson watched her talk and tried to focus entirely on the legal content, which was genuinely important, and found it harder than expected. She had an energy when she was working through a problem that was not exactly easy to ignore, a quality of entire engagement, as if whatever she was thinking about had her whole attention, and when she turned that attention on him to ask a question or make a point, it was a startlingly direct experience. He realized over the second cup of coffee, in some amount of trouble, not legal trouble, the other kind. The next morning, Letitia was at the land office before dawn. Nelson knew this because he had ridden back into town at first light on the sensible professional grounds that he needed to discuss the case further, and found her lantern already burning in the window. She had been writing by lamplight, surrounded by open books and papers, and she had a piece of cornbread from the night before sitting on the edge of the desk that she had apparently forgotten to eat. "You did not sleep," he said. "I slept 4 hours. That is sufficient." She looked up. "Did you bring coffee?" He had thought to stop at the hotel kitchen, which opened early for the miners who worked the early shift at the remaining small-scale copper operation north of town, and he had brought 2 tin mugs. He set one on the edge of her desk, carefully, away from the papers. "Thank you," she said, and she said it with a simplicity that made it more genuine than most elaborate expressions of gratitude he had received. He sat down in the chair on his side of the counter, and she came around from behind it and sat in the other chair, and they talked while the town woke up around them. She told him about what she had found in Hiram's records overnight, a pattern in Morrow's filings that suggested he was working with someone inside the Prescott land office who was altering registration dates on deeds before they were officially recorded. It was careful, sophisticated fraud, the kind that was hard to see unless you were looking for it across multiple cases, which was exactly what she had been doing for 4 months. Nelson told her about the ranch. Not the legal aspects of it, though she already knew better than he did, but the ranch itself, what it looked like at different times of year, the way the river sounded in spring when the snowmelt came off the Bradshaw Mountains, the particular quality of the grass in the lower pasture that made it ideal for cattle, the morning light on the canyon wall that turned the rock from red to gold with the kind of gradual beauty that never got old no matter how many years you watched it. She listened. Not politely, not with the half-attention of someone waiting for their turn to speak, but with genuine quiet attention that he found unexpectedly moving. "You love it," she said. "I built it," he said, as if that were the same thing, and then, because she was looking at him in a way that made him more honest than he would ordinarily be with someone he had met yesterday. "Yes, I love it." "Then we are going to keep it," she said, and went back to her papers with a purposeful energy that Nelson found, if he was being entirely honest with himself, entirely magnetic. On the second day, Gerald Morrow arrived in Calico Bend. He came in a hired coach from Tucson, accompanied by his attorney, a compact man named Frederick Hale who wore a dark suit and carried a leather document case, and moved through the town with the careful confidence of a man accustomed to winning arguments in rooms where the other person did not understand the rules. Morrow himself was a heavy man in his 50s, well-fed and sharp-eyed, with the kind of permanent half-smile that suggested he found other people's difficulties mildly entertaining. Nelson saw them arrive from across the street, and he had to consciously unclench his jaw and remind himself that the best thing he could do right now was exactly nothing, because Letitia had been very specific on this point. "You are not to speak to Morrow or his attorney without me present," she had told him that morning, with the firmness of someone who had clearly dealt with clients who thought they could handle things themselves. "I understand the impulse. I know that looking at that man makes you want to say things that would feel extremely satisfying in the moment and extremely damaging to our case in court. Do not do it. Your job for the next 2 days is to keep being the upstanding citizen who has been on that land for 12 years. Can you do that?" He had told her yes, though it had taken a moment. Morrow and Hale went to the registrar's office first, and Nelson could see, from across the street, the moment when Clive Potter showed them the counterclaim, because Hale's expression went flat and Morrow's half-smile disappeared. They emerged 10 minutes later and walked directly to the hotel. Nelson went to the land office. Letitia was ready for them. She had her documentation organized in 3 separate folders, each labeled, each containing specific evidence grouped by legal argument. She had written to the Prescott land office that morning, by way of an urgent express rider she had hired with what she told Nelson was her own money, and which he absolutely intended to reimburse, requesting the original registration logs for the year 1869. She had also written to 2 other county clerks in adjacent territories where Morrow had filed similar claims, requesting their documentation. "Will all of that arrive in time?" Nelson asked. "The Prescott records may arrive by tomorrow afternoon if the writer is fast. The others are less certain, but I do not need all of them." She tapped the folder on her right. "What I need is to establish that your 1870 homestead filing is properly documented and prior in practice to Morrow's 1869 deed, because the 1869 deed, I believe, was not actually filed in 1869. I believe it was filed in 1875 with the date altered retroactively." She looked at him. "The ink will tell us. Documents have a physical history. If I can get a good look at the original of Morrow's deed under sufficient magnification, I can tell you whether the date ink matches the body ink, and if it does not, that is the center of our case." "How do you get a look at Morrow's original deed?" "The hearing," she said. "When a deed is entered as evidence in a territorial court hearing, I have the right to examine it. That is when I look." She paused and added more quietly, "It is a significant risk. If I am wrong about the ink, we will need to win on other grounds and it will be harder. But I do not think I am wrong." Nelson looked at her. "You have been right about everything so far." She met his eyes, and for a moment neither of them said anything, and the morning light came through the window and settled across the desk between them, and the air was very still. "I am not always right," she said, "but I am very careful, and in law, carefulness is most of what right requires." He nodded slowly. Then he said, because it had been sitting in him since the previous evening, "Where are you from, Miss Bristol, before Michigan?" She was quiet for a moment, the kind of quiet that is a decision. "Ohio," she said, "a small town called Maplewood. My father was a circuit judge. Then law runs in the family." He would have said so. "He died when I was 17. The court took his seat before he was properly cold and gave it to a man who was less qualified and more connected." She said this without bitterness, just with the flat accuracy of someone describing a fact they have long since finished being angry about. "I decided at that point that if I wanted justice to be done correctly, I would have to do it myself." Nelson understood something about her then, something that had been at the edges of his understanding since she first turned to face him across that counter. She was not here because she was brave or reckless or crusading. She was here because she had decided, with full knowledge of the cost, that the right thing required her presence, and she had arranged herself accordingly. It was a quality he recognized, because, in a much smaller and less articulate way, it was the same quality that had kept him on that land through every hardship that had tried to drive him off it. He wanted to say this to her and could not find a way to say it that did not sound either presumptuous or foolish. He said instead, "I am glad Hiram took ill." She looked at him with startled eyes, and then laughed, a short, genuine sound that was the first fully unguarded thing he had heard from her, and it changed her face in a way that made his chest do something inconvenient. "That is a terrible thing to say," she told him, and she was still smiling. "It is," he agreed, "but I mean it." On the afternoon of the second day, Frederick Hale came to the land office. He came alone, without Morrow, which was a deliberate choice. Letitia recognized it for what it was, which was an attempt to have a professional conversation between attorneys from which the emotional, invested client would be excluded. She let him in. She asked Nelson to wait outside, which he did, sitting on the wooden bench in front of the office with his hat in his hands, and watching the street with the focused stillness of a man who has been told not to punch anyone. Ezra Goodnight came and sat beside him after a while, bringing a small paper parcel of dried beef that he shared without comment. They sat in the afternoon sun and talked about cattle for 20 minutes. Nelson was grateful for it. When Hale came back out, he did not look at Nelson. Nelson did not look at Hale. Both of them managed this with impeccable composure. Letitia appeared in the doorway a moment later, looked at Nelson, and gave a very small nod that meant she would tell him later. She told him at supper. They had settled into the habit of supper at the hotel dining room without formally discussing it, which was either professionally appropriate. They had genuine case business to discuss, or something else, depending on which part of Nelson's mind was doing the evaluating. "He offered to settle," she said. "The offer was that you would sell the Creek Ranch tomorrow at 2/3 of its assessed value, and all litigation would cease, and Morrow would not pursue you on the legal costs." "That is not a settlement," Nelson said. "That is a robbery with extra steps." "That is what I told him," she said, in more formal language, but the substance was the same. She stirred her coffee. "He was not surprised that I declined. He made the offer because he was required to attempt settlement before the hearing. The interesting thing was what he said after I declined." "What did he say?" "Said that Judge Pratt had seen a great many homestead claims come before him in the past 3 years, and that most of them had been decided in favor of the documented deed holder." She paused. "He said this as a piece of information, neutrally. The implication was that the judge had a track record that favored Morrow's position." Nelson sat with this for a moment. "Are you telling me the judge is bought?" "I am telling you that it is a possibility I cannot rule out, and which Hale wanted me to be aware of." She looked at him directly. "It does not change our strategy. The evidence is the evidence. If the judge is genuinely impartial, the evidence wins. If the judge is not impartial, then what happens in that courtroom will be on the official record, which means it can be appealed to the territorial court in Prescott, and a man who has bought a circuit judge in multiple counties has made himself a target that the federal government will eventually take an interest in. So we win either way," he said. "Eventually," she said. "The question is whether eventually is the same as Friday." He wanted to say something reassuring, which he recognized as an impulse born partly out of genuine belief in her, and partly out of the fact that she looked, in this moment, very slightly not certain, and his instinct when she was not certain was to shore up whatever she needed. He kept the impulse at a reasonable check and said simply, "Tell me what else you need from me." She looked at him across the table with an expression he had not seen from her before, something softer and more direct, and said, "I need you to trust me." "I do," he said. He had not hesitated, and the absence of hesitation surprised both of them equally. The morning of the third day brought the Prescott rider. Nelson was at the land office early, as had become his habit, with coffee from the hotel kitchen, and the young rider came in covered in trail dust at 8:30, carrying a sealed envelope from the Prescott land office addressed to Letitia Bristol, attorney at law, in the care of the Calico Bend registrar. Letitia broke the seal with controlled hands and read what was inside, and Nelson watched her read it. He had learned to read her expressions over the past 3 days in the way you learn a country you are traveling through, not completely, but enough to know the significant landmarks. When she set down the letter and looked up at him, her face was carrying the particular quality of a woman who has just found what she was looking for. "The original registration log for 1869 shows no entry under Morrow's name," she said. "The log for 1875 shows a crossed-out entry that was rewritten. The registrar in Prescott, a gentleman named Howard, who has been in that position for 9 years, states in this letter that he recalls the 1875 re-registration because it was unusual and required a supervisor's approval, and that the date on the deed was listed as 1869 at that time, but that the original registration was in 1875. She set the letter down. "He will not come here to testify, the notice was too short for that, but he will send an affidavit, and he has included a certified copy of the 1875 log page." Nelson let out a slow breath. "That is the center of the case." "That is the center of the case," she agreed. "The ink examination at the hearing will corroborate it, but this affidavit, if Judge Pratt is an honest man, is sufficient." She looked at him steadily. "Now we wait for tomorrow." Friday came the way important days tend to come in the territory, quietly, with a sunrise so straightforwardly beautiful that it seemed almost rude, the sky going from deep purple to blazing gold above the canyon walls with a smooth perfection that had nothing to say about what was at stake for any particular person standing beneath it. Nelson was up at dawn. He had stayed in Calico Bend the previous night at Ezra's insistence. "No point riding back and forth on the last day," Ezra had said, with characteristic practicality, and had slept in the hotel with the unusual quality of sleep that comes when everything that can be done has been done, and the next thing is beyond your control. He dressed carefully, which was not his usual approach to getting dressed. He wore his cleanest shirt, which was a dark blue cotton, and his better jacket, which he had brought into town on the second day at Letitia's indirect suggestion. She had mentioned, without looking at him, that appearance in court was a form of argument, and that a man who looked like he belonged to the land he claimed made a different impression than a man who looked like he had been pulled from a bunkhouse. He knocked on the door of the room next to his at the hotel, which was Letitia's room, at 7 o'clock, because they had agreed the night before to go over the documentation one final time before the hearing. When she opened the door, she was already fully dressed, in a deep charcoal gray skirt and a white blouse with a high collar and a small brooch at the throat, and she had her legal papers in a leather folder under her arm, and she looked extremely professional and entirely composed. She also looked, he thought, as she stepped into the corridor and turned toward the staircase with her head up and her back straight, like someone he very much did not want to lose once this was over. He said nothing about this. He said, "Good morning, here is your coffee." She took it with a quiet thank you, and they went over the documents in the hotel dining room, and by the time they walked to the small building at the end of Main Street that served as the court when Judge Pratt was in town, Nelson felt as prepared as a man can feel when someone else is doing the fighting on his behalf. The room was small, a dozen rows of rough wooden benches, a raised table at the front for the judge, two smaller tables facing it for the respective parties. Nelson sat at the table on the left. Letitia sat beside him with her folder open. Across the room, Gerald Morrow sat with Frederick Hale, who arranged his documents with a precision that was professional but not, Nelson thought, as thoroughly organized as the woman sitting next to him. Judge Henry Pratt was a big man, somewhere in his late 50s, with a gray beard and the slow, deliberate manner of someone who had seen a great deal and had organized his reactions accordingly. He came in from the back, settled into his chair, looked around the room without expression, and then looked at the two tables in front of him with the focused attention of a man doing a job. "I have reviewed the filed documents," he said. "We are here on the matter of Morrow versus Sheridan, concerning title to the Sheridan Creek Ranch property, 412 acres, Morales River West Bank. Counterclaim filed on behalf of Nelson Sheridan by Letitia Bristol, attorney. Miss Bristol," he looked at her. "You may present." Letitia stood. What happened in the next 90 minutes was, in Nelson's experience, the most quietly dramatic thing he had ever witnessed. He had seen cattle stampedes and flash floods, and a man outshoot 3 others in a dispute outside a Tucson saloon, and all of those things had a raw, physical urgency to them that was easy to feel. What Letitia did in that courtroom was a different kind of urgency, careful, built sentence by sentence, document by document, the way a stone arch is built, each piece resting on the ones before it until the whole structure holds itself up by its own logic. She laid out the homestead filing from 1870. She walked the judge through the survey. She presented the land office letters. She introduced Ezra Goodnight, who testified in the plain, unhurried way that Letitia had clearly prepared him for, not dramatic, not emotional, just factual and precise and impossible to doubt, because he was so obviously telling the truth. Then she turned to the Prescott registrar's affidavit and the certified log page, and Nelson watched Judge Pratt read those with an attention that stilled the room. Then she asked the court to examine the original of Morrow's deed. Frederick Hale objected, with grounds that were technical and reasonable. Judge Pratt overruled him. The deed was produced. Letitia examined it under her magnifying glass for 2 minutes, while the room was so quiet that Nelson could hear the man in the second row breathing. Then she turned to the judge and said, in a voice so steady it made the words feel inevitable, "The date inscription on this deed, Your Honor, is written in a different ink than the body of the document. The body ink has the oxidation characteristic of 7 years age, consistent with 1875. The date ink has the oxidation characteristic of 13 years age, consistent with 1869. This deed was backdated." Hale was on his feet. Morrow had gone the color of old chalk. The judge raised one hand with a quietness that stopped everything in the room. Judge Pratt looked at the deed for a long time. He had his own magnifying glass, which he produced from his coat pocket, and he used it. Then he set both things down and looked at Frederick Hale with an expression that was not angry exactly, but that had in it a finality that Nelson recognized. It was the expression of a man who has seen what he needed to see and has made a decision from which he will not be moved. "Counsel for the claimant," the judge said to Hale, "are you in a position to refute the testimony of the Prescott Land Office Registrar and the physical evidence before this court. Hale stood very straight. "I would request time to—" "No," said Judge Pratt. "You would not." In the silence that followed, a fly buzzed against the window. The judge ruled in Nelson's favor in language that was brief and absolute. He declared Morrow's deed fraudulent on the preponderance of evidence, affirmed Nelson Sheridan's ownership of the Sheridan Creek Ranch in full, and noted for the official record that the matter of Gerald Morrow's land dealings in Arizona Territory would be referred to the federal prosecutor's office in Prescott for further investigation. Gerald Morrow and Frederick Hale left the courtroom without looking at anyone. Outside on the wooden sidewalk, in the full blaze of the Arizona noon, Nelson stood in the sunlight and felt the particular quality of relief that is not just the absence of fear, but the restoration of something that had always been his. He felt the ranch, the grass, the river, the canyon wall, the 12 years of his work built into every inch of it settle back into him the way a breath settles into a body after holding. He turned and Letitia was beside him, and she was looking at the street with the same expression she had worn on the evening she filed the counterclaim, that calm and settled quality that was its own kind of satisfaction. "You were right about the ink," he said. "I am generally right about ink," she said, and then she turned and looked at him, and her expression was different from any expression he had seen on her in the past 3 days. The professional composure was still there, but it had something behind it now, something warmer and less certain, and she was looking at him the way you look at something you are not entirely sure you are allowed to want. He had been waiting 3 days to say something, and now he said it because the case was over and there was no professional reason not to, and because he was not, at heart, a man who waited longer than necessary. "I would very much like to show you the ranch," he said. "Not for legal purposes." She was quiet for a moment, in the way he had come to recognize as genuine consideration. "Not for legal purposes," she repeated. "I want you to see the river in the morning," he said, "and the canyon wall when the light is right, and the pasture where I first plowed in 1870, which is the best piece of pasture in the territory and which I have described to you poorly, because you would have to see it to understand." He paused. "And I would like to continue eating supper with you, if that is something you would consider." She looked at him for a long, measured moment, and then the corner of her mouth lifted, the small, precise smile that he had already catalogued as the one she could not entirely manage to suppress when she was genuinely amused. "I think," she said carefully, "that I could consider a great many things." They rode out to the ranch the following morning. Letitia rode well, not the way a frontier woman rides, born to it, but the way someone rides who learned properly and took it seriously, with a good seat and steady hands. She had hired a bay mare from the Calico Bend livery, and she came down Main Street at a sensible trot and pulled up beside Nelson's gray gelding with the self-contained ease that seemed to characterize everything she did. The road north from town ran through a stretch of open country where the red rock ridges fell back from the road, and the land spread wide in every direction, the kind of space that still caught Nelson in the chest after 12 years, the sheer, uncontained roominess of it under a sky that went on forever. He watched Letitia as they rode and saw the moment when the country registered on her. She sat up a little straighter, her eyes going wider, her head turning to take in the ridges and the sky and the distance with the full attention she gave to everything. "You grew up in Ohio," he said. "Trees," she said. "Everywhere trees. The sky is narrow in Ohio." She looked out across the open country. "This is—" "Yes," he said. She glanced at him and he held her gaze for a moment, and then they both looked back at the road ahead. When they came over the last rise before the ranch, where the road dipped down through a cut in the sandstone and the valley opened up below, Nelson slowed his horse without meaning to. He always slowed here. It was the first proper view of the ranch, where you could see the whole of it at once: the house, solidly built of adobe and timber, the barn and outbuildings in their working arrangement, the fences running clean and straight across the pasture, the cattle moving in the lower field, and the river glinting in the morning sun beyond the eastern fence line. And beyond the river, the canyon wall rising in its permanent, indifferent beauty. He heard Letitia exhale beside him. "You built all of this," she said quietly. "It was not a question." "Every bit," he said. She was quiet for a long time, looking. Then she said, "It is one of the most beautiful things I have ever seen." He was not sure if she meant the ranch or the view, but he was aware, riding down into his own valley on a clear May morning with this woman beside him, that the whole landscape looked different than it had looked for the past 3 days, which had been the 3 most frightening days of his ownership of it. It looked like itself again. It looked like home. He showed her everything. He showed her the house, which was clean and spare and organized in the way of a man who had lived alone for years, but who had built carefully, with good proportions and solid workmanship. He showed her the barn, where 2 of his horses looked up with mild interest at the stranger. He showed her the lower pasture, which was as good as he had told her, the grass thick and dark green along the river bank, the cattle in good condition. He showed her the place where he had cut his first furrow in 1870, which was now, 12 years later, his kitchen garden, producing the practical crops he grew for himself. And he took her to the river. It was wider in May than it would be in summer, still running fast with the last of the mountain snowmelt, clear over the gravel bottom, cold and quick over the larger rocks. There was a place along the bank where a flat sandstone shelf extended over the water, warm from the morning sun, and he had come to this place so many times over the years that the stone was worn smooth where he habitually sat. He showed her this place without explanation, and she sat on the stone and took off her shoes, something he had not expected, and put her feet in the water, and said nothing for several minutes. He sat beside her with appropriate distance and watched the river. "My father loved rivers," she said after a while. "He would take me fishing on the Scioto in the summer. I was a very bad fisherman, but I was good at sitting still and being quiet, which he said was the only real skill required." She paused. "I think about him when I am near water." "He would be proud of you," Nelson said. She was quiet for a moment, then she said, "I hope so." He was not certain I should go into law, not because he thought I could not do it. He was certain I could do it, he just knew what it cost. Nelson thought about this. Was the cost what he expected? "Higher," she said, without self-pity, just accurately. "But so are the good parts." He looked at the river. "I know something about that." She looked at him then with a clear-eyed directness that was characteristic of her, but with something additional in it that made his pulse do an inconvenient thing. "You are not what I expected," she said. "What did you expect?" "From the documentation, a thorough man, certainly, careful, stubborn. The 12 years of receipts suggested a particular kind of personality. She appeared to be considering something. I did not expect you to listen the way you listen." He was not sure what to say to that, so he said, "You are not what I expected either." "What did you expect?" "I did not expect anything," he said. "I walked into that land office not knowing you existed, and everything that has happened since has been considerably different from anything I would have planned." She smiled, the small, precise smile, and then a larger one that followed it, less controlled. She had, he thought, a very good smile when she let it go fully, a whole-face kind of smile that made her seem younger and warmer and entirely real. They sat by the river for an hour before going back to the house. Letitia helped him with the practical work of the afternoon, which he had been behind on given 3 days away, without being asked, and without making a production of it. She was not a ranch woman by training, but she was competent and observant, and followed his lead without needing to be told things twice, and they worked comfortably in the easy way of 2 people whose rhythms happened to be compatible. At supper, which Nelson cooked, a simple meal of stewed beef and biscuits that he made adequately well, she sat at the oak table under the lamplight and told him about the other cases she was planning to pursue. Morrow's operation was the largest, but there were 2 smaller land fraud situations she had identified in neighboring counties, and there was a family in Cochise County whose water rights had been seized by a mining company through documents she believed were similarly questionable. He listened and asked questions and watched her hands move when she talked about something that mattered to her, which was a habit he had noticed. "You could set up a practice in Calico Bend," he said. She looked at him. Calico Bend is a small town, with a great deal of land around it that belongs to people who do not always know how to protect it. He paused. Hiram Calley is old and half-deaf, and the land office needs someone who actually knows law. The town is close enough to the county seat for court access, and you know the territory now, at least this part of it. She was quiet, looking at her coffee cup. "Are you making a professional suggestion," she said carefully, "or a different kind of suggestion?" He met her eyes. "Both," he said. The word sat between them, clear and honest, and she held his gaze for a moment with an expression that was thinking and feeling at the same time. "I have spent 2 years establishing myself in a profession where most people would prefer I did not exist," she said slowly. "Every case I take knowing that half the room will dismiss me before I open my mouth. I cannot afford to make decisions that compromise my ability to do the work." "I know that," he said. "I am not asking you to compromise anything. I am asking you to consider that this is a good place, and that the people here need what you know, and that he stopped and organized his words more carefully. "I would be glad of your presence, however that comes." She looked at him for a long, searching moment. Then she said, "Let me think about it." "That is all I am asking," he said. She stayed at the ranch that night in the spare room, with complete propriety, the spare room being small and clean, and having a window that looked east toward the canyon wall, which she had apparently stood at for some time in the dark before sleeping, because the window was still open in the morning and the chair was pulled up to it. In the morning she was up before he was, which should not have surprised him but did. He came to the kitchen to find that she had started the fire and put coffee on, and she was standing outside the front door with a cup in both hands, watching the sunrise on the canyon wall. He came and stood beside her with his own cup, and they watched the rock go from gray to red to gold in the early light. The cattle moved in the lower pasture, and the river caught the first sun in a flash of silver, and somewhere up in the rimrock a hawk turned wide, slow circles in the warming air. He wanted to say something and did not. He thought she probably did not need him to. After a while she said, very quietly, "I think I would like to see this every morning." He did not say anything immediately. He was careful with this because it mattered, and he did not want to be presumptuous or to rush past something that deserved its full weight. Then he said, just as quietly, "I would be very glad of that." She turned to look at him, and the morning light was full on her face, and she was not wearing her professional expression at all. She was wearing an expression he had not seen yet, which was open and a little uncertain and entirely honest, and he understood that this was what she looked like when she was not managing anything or preparing any argument, when she was simply herself in a moment that mattered. He reached out and took her free hand gently, and she did not pull back. She curled her fingers around his, and they stood like that in the morning light for a long time, watching the sun come up over Nelson Sheridan's ranch, which was his, which was whole, which was more than it had been 3 days ago by a considerable amount. The following weeks settled into a pattern that neither of them had planned, and both of them had clearly wanted without knowing quite how to arrange it. Letitia returned to Calico Bend, to the land office and to the work that needed doing, but she rode out to the ranch on Saturdays. Nelson rode into town on Tuesdays, ostensibly to manage the business of the case's aftermath. There was paperwork to file formally establishing his ownership on the new terms, communications to send regarding Morrow's wider activities. But actually, they both knew, because Tuesday had become a day he arranged himself around. Gerald Morrow was arrested in Tucson 6 weeks after the hearing, taken in by federal marshals on fraud charges that encompassed his activities in 4 Arizona counties. Frederick Hale turned state's evidence, which was both strategically understandable and professionally dishonorable, and the man inside the Prescott land office who had been altering registration dates was removed from his position and charged accordingly. Letitia heard all of this via correspondence, and received each piece of news with a calm satisfaction that Nelson found quietly wonderful. The satisfaction of someone who has done a piece of work that will keep doing good after they have moved on from it. The work of rebuilding the legal landscape of the county kept her busy. She formally established herself as a practitioner in Calico Bend, renting the front room of a building on Main Street that had previously been a surveyor's office. Hiram Calley recovered sufficiently from his illness to be glad of the help, and wise enough to recognize that he was receiving it from someone considerably more capable than himself, which he acknowledged with a gruff good humor that Letitia seemed to genuinely appreciate. The town took time to warm to her, because a woman attorney was still a thing that required adjustment from most people. But Calico Bend was a working town, a town of ranchers and miners and small shopkeepers who understood competence when they saw it, and word of what she had done for Nelson Sheridan spread with the efficiency that small-town word always spreads. By midsummer, there were 3 other clients on her books, 2 of them land-related, and one of them, a water rights dispute that she had resolved in under a week by finding a provision in an 1876 territorial statute that the opposing party's attorney had apparently never read. Nelson watched all of this with a pride that he had no formal claim to and felt anyway, the pride of someone who knows they are watching a person doing exactly what they are meant to do. On a Saturday evening in July, with the day's heat settled into a long, warm dusk and the first stars appearing above the canyon rim, he and Letitia were sitting on the front step of the ranch house with the remains of supper between them and the empty miles of the territory spread out before them in the last light, and he said, "I have been thinking about something." "You have been thinking about it for 3 weeks," she said, without looking up from the letter she was finishing. "I have been noticing." He looked at the side of her face. "Have you?" "Yes." She folded the letter with precise hands and set it aside and looked at him. Her expression was that particular combination of calm and direct, and warmly amused that he had come to think of as entirely, specifically hers. "I have also been thinking about it." "And," he said, "and I think," she said carefully, "that I would like to ask you some clarifying questions before I give you my answer. Because I believe we have the same thing in mind, but I have learned that assumptions are dangerous in law and in life, and I would like to be clear." "Ask," he said. "Are you asking me to stay in Calico Bend permanently as an attorney with her own practice?" "Yes, among other things." "Among other things," she repeated. "Are you asking me to marry you?" He met her eyes. "Yes." She was quiet for a moment, and in that quiet the evening sound settled around them, a cricket starting up somewhere near the fence, the river distant and soft, the horses moving in the barn. "I want you to understand what you would be taking on," she said. "I will always practice law. That is not something I am able to set aside. There will be cases that are difficult and cases that take time and cases that bring people to our door who are frightened and in need, and that will be a permanent feature of our life together." "I know," he said, "and you do not mind." "I built this ranch 12 years on my own," he said. "What I mind is the prospect of continuing to do anything on my own, now that I know what it is like to do it with you." She looked at him for a long, full moment, and then she reached out and took his hand, as she had taken his hand in the morning light 2 months ago, and she said, "Then yes." He leaned toward her and she leaned toward him, and in the warm dusk on the front step of the ranch house with the territory spreading away in all directions and the first stars coming out, he kissed her for the first time, and she kissed him back with the complete, focused attention she brought to everything that mattered. The wedding was in September. They were married in the Calico Bend Church by the Reverend Thomas Cross, on a Sunday morning when the cottonwood trees along the riverbank had just begun to turn gold, their leaves flickering in the small wind that came off the canyon in the early fall. The church was full, not the overflowing full of a town event, but the solid full of people who had come because they genuinely wanted to be there. Ezra Goodnight stood up for Nelson. A woman named Clara Abbott, who ran the dry goods store and had become Letitia's first friend in Calico Bend in the way that practical women who respect competence in each other become friends, stood up for Letitia. Letitia wore a dress she had made herself, a deep burgundy wool appropriate to the approaching fall, with a collar of white lace that had been her mother's, carefully transported from Ohio in the bottom of her trunk. She wore her hair down, which Nelson had only seen once before, on a morning when she had not expected him to come to the door quite as early as he had, and which he thought, standing at the front of the church watching her come down the aisle, was the most beautiful thing he had ever seen. The vows were traditional, because Letitia had given them some thought and decided that the traditional words had a weight and a precision she respected. But when the Reverend reached the part about obeying, there was a moment where Letitia looked at Nelson with one raised eyebrow, and Nelson pressed his mouth together to contain the smile, and even the Reverend seemed to sense that some adaptation was called for. What was said in the end was mutual and sufficient, and the ring Nelson had had made by the silversmith in Tucson, a plain band with a small turquoise stone, the deep blue-green color of the Arizona sky, fit exactly right. Outside the church in the September sunshine, with the whole town moving around them in the warm noise of a celebration, Ezra Goodnight shook Nelson's hand with a grip that said everything that needed saying and some things that did not need saying and were said anyway. 12 years of watching you be stubborn and alone, Ezra said, and the one thing it took to fix it was a lawyer. The right lawyer, Nelson said. Ezra looked at Letitia, who was talking to Clara Abbott with an animation that Nelson did not often see in professional settings and which he recognized as genuine happiness. She is going to keep you honest, Ezra said. She already does, Nelson said. I find I do not mind it at all. They moved into the ranch together in the way of two people who are both accustomed to their own habits and are genuinely interested in the work of combining them. There were some adjustments. Nelson had organized his house with the economy of a man who lived alone, and Letitia's arrival added, among other things, 6 crates of law books, a writing desk that needed to be placed where the light was best, and a set of cooking implements that suggested she was a considerably better cook than he was, which he admitted without difficulty, and which led to an immediate improvement in his daily life. The front room of the ranch house became her home office in the evenings, when she was not in her Calico Bend office, and the oak table where Nelson had always eaten and occasionally worked became a shared space where they ate together and reviewed documents and talked, and sometimes sat in the particular comfortable quiet of two people who do not need to fill silence because they are entirely at ease in it. She learned the ranch with the same methodical attention she gave to a new legal territory, asking questions and observing and building up her knowledge piece by piece until, by the end of their first winter together, she could manage the morning feed and check the fence line and tell when a cow was off feed with a competence that was not instinctive but was entirely reliable, which Nelson thought was in some ways better than instinctive. He learned to read her work, or to try to, and found that every case she took had in it something he admired. The same quality he had first seen in the land office counterclaim, the quality of someone who had thought more carefully than the other side and organized her arguments with a precision that was quietly devastating when the moment came for it. In the spring of 1883, a few months into their first year of marriage, Letitia told Nelson on a Monday morning that they were going to have a baby. She told him in her direct way, over coffee, sitting at the oak table, watching his face with the calm observational quality that she brought to most situations. What she saw in his face was a stillness, and then a sequence of things that moved through him too quickly to separate, and then something that settled and stayed, which was a happiness so genuine it was almost uncomfortable to contain. He set down his cup. He said, "Are you well?" "I am very well," she said. He got up and came around the table, and she stood up because she knew what he intended, and he held her with both arms and she put her face against his chest, and they stood there in the kitchen of the ranch house while the morning sun came through the window, and the cattle moved in the lower pasture, and the river ran cool and clear beyond the fence. "A baby," he said, into her hair. "In October, I think," she said. "Possibly November." He pulled back enough to look at her, and she was smiling with the full, unguarded smile, the one that changed her face, and he kissed her forehead and her temple and then, more deliberately, her mouth, and she laughed against his lips, which was a sound that he was fairly certain he had been put on this earth to hear. The pregnancy was a practical matter for Letitia, which meant she continued working through most of it, with modifications. She rode less, and rode more carefully. She structured her court appearances so that the most demanding ones fell in the earlier months, and she reviewed and reorganized her entire case load with a strategic efficiency that left her in an entirely manageable position by August. She was not, she told Nelson serenely, about to be inconvenienced by biology to the extent of not working, but she was also not about to be foolish, and the two positions were in her view entirely compatible. Nelson fussed over her in the understated way of a man who has been alone a long time and is now deeply invested in the well-being of another person and is not entirely sure of the appropriate degree of fussing. Letitia found this endearing and told him so, which made him feel both embarrassed and pleased. He expanded the house in late summer, adding a proper second bedroom off the back, built with the same solid workmanship as the original structure, with a window that caught the morning light and a floor of smooth-fitted pine boards that he laid himself over the course of 3 weeks. The baby came in October, as Letitia had predicted, on a cool, clear evening when the canyon wall had gone the deep purple of late dusk, and the first cold of autumn was in the air. Ezra Goodnight rode for the midwife, a capable woman named Agnes Drummond from the south end of town, who had delivered a large portion of the younger population of Calico Bend, and was as unruffleable as the canyon itself. Nelson waited in the kitchen, as the custom of the time required, and found that he was considerably less able to manage waiting than he had previously considered himself to be. He split a week's worth of firewood in the side yard. He made coffee 4 times without drinking any of it. He stood in the yard under the October stars and tried to hear only the night sounds and mostly failed. When Agnes Drummond came to the kitchen door and told him he could come in, she told him first that his wife was well and whole, which was the information he needed above all others, and then she told him that he had a son. He was a solidly built boy, red-faced from the effort of arriving, with dark eyes that would probably change color and a quantity of dark hair that suggested he had opinions about something already. Letitia held him with the focused, tender attention she brought to everything, and when she looked up at Nelson standing in the doorway, her expression was the most open he had ever seen it, tired and triumphant and absolutely, entirely happy. He crossed the room in 3 steps and sat on the edge of the bed, and she leaned against him and he looked at the boy in her arms, this new person who had not existed this morning and was now the most present fact in the room. "He needs a name," she said. Nelson looked at his son for a moment. "What do you think?" he asked her. It was the way they made most decisions, which was to say together. "I like the name James," she said. "My father's name was James." "James Sheridan," Nelson said, testing it. It sounded solid and right and permanent, like something that would last. "James Edward Sheridan," Letitia said. "After your father." He looked at her. "You remembered." "You mentioned him once," she said simply. It seemed worth remembering. He pulled her gently closer and pressed his lips to her temple, and she leaned into him with the baby between them. And outside the window the October stars were very bright, and the canyon was dark, and the river ran softly in the distance, and the ranch that Nelson had built with 12 years of solitary effort held them all, warm and solid and entirely whole. James Sheridan proved himself, in the months that followed, to be a child of strong character and considerable noise, who observed the world around him with dark, intent eyes that clearly came from his mother, and who expressed his opinions about everything with a volume that suggested he was making up for all the time before he had a voice. Nelson carried him everywhere he could in the early mornings when Letitia was working and the baby was awake. Nelson would tuck him into the crook of his arm and walk the fence line or check the cattle or stand at the riverbank and talk to him about the ranch, the way Nelson's father had talked to him about Ohio, naming things and describing them and explaining the how and the why, as if the boy were older and the information urgently needed. Letitia watched this from the window sometimes and felt a quality of happiness that she had not expected, specifically when she had imagined her life. She had imagined competence. She had imagined the satisfaction of the work. She had not quite imagined this, the ranch in the early light, the man she loved walking with their son along the fence line, the particular golden quality of the morning air, the sense of a life that was full in every direction she turned. She continued practicing law. This was not a question. She took the water rights case she had mentioned the previous year and won it. She took a case on behalf of a Mexican family in the southern part of the county, whose land was being encroached on by an Anglo cattleman with political connections, and won that too, though it took 4 months and a great deal more effort, and the victory required her to present before a judge in Tucson who made no secret of his skepticism about her standing, which she answered with such precise and comprehensive legal argument that, by the end of the day, even the opposing attorney was looking at her with a species of reluctant respect. Word of her work spread through the territory in the steady, reliable way that a good reputation travels, which is not quickly but durably. By 1884, she was receiving correspondence from attorneys in Tucson and Prescott who wanted to consult on territorial land law, and once from a law professor at a university in the East who had heard of the Morrow case and wanted to use it as a teaching example. She answered him in detail, which she enjoyed, and declined an invitation to come and lecture in person, which she did not particularly enjoy declining, but which was not compatible with the life she was building and which was, she thought, the better choice. Nelson expanded the herd in the fall of 1883 and again in the spring of 1884, buying a small additional parcel of land to the south that added 80 acres of good river-bottom pasture to the ranch. The operation grew to a size that required a permanent hired hand, and he brought on a young man named Will Patterson from New Mexico, who was 22, quiet, hardworking, and had the instinctive feel for cattle that some men had and which could not entirely be taught. Ezra Goodnight, at 62, was slowing down on his own ranch, but was still the neighbor Nelson trusted most, and the two men continued the habit of Saturday morning rides along the fence line that they had maintained since 1871. The kind of friendship that does not require effort because it has been proven over so much time that it has become structural. In the summer of 1884, when James was just past his first birthday and had recently discovered that he was capable of walking, which he applied to the problem of reaching everything in the house that he had previously been frustrated by, Letitia told Nelson on a Thursday evening that they were going to have another baby. He received this news with the same sequence of stillness and then happiness, though with a somewhat greater degree of practiced composure this time, and a somewhat shorter period of standing in the yard under the stars because it was July and hot. "James will have a sibling," Letitia said, watching him with the amused expression that she wore when she was watching him process things. "James will be alarmed," Nelson said. "He has arranged the household entirely to his own preferences." "James will adapt," Letitia said serenely. "He has your stubbornness and my organizational intelligence. He will find a way to manage it." The second child arrived in February of 1885, on a cold, bright morning when the canyon was dusted with the light snow that came occasionally to the high country in winter, and which never lasted. This one was faster in the arriving and less dramatic about it, and when Agnes Drummond handed the baby to Nelson this time, because Letitia decided it was only fair. He looked down at a daughter with eyes that were already the precise gray of her mother's, and a composed expression that suggested she had arrived with full knowledge of the situation and a plan for managing it. "She looks like she is reviewing a document," Nelson said. "She looks," Letitia said from the bed, with enormous satisfaction, "exactly like herself." They named her Clara Elena Sheridan, for Clara Abbott, who had been the first person in Calico Bend to treat Letitia with uncomplicated friendship, and Elena for no particular reason except that both of them liked the sound of it and agreed it suited the small, composed face that was already looking around the room with gray eyes that missed nothing. James received his sister with initial uncertainty, and then, after approximately 3 days, a proprietary protectiveness that manifested as standing between Clara and anything he considered a potential hazard, including the dogs, the chickens, and any stranger who came to the door. Nelson observed this with private amusement and something that felt very much like pride. The ranch house, already expanded once, grew again in the spring of 1885, this time with a proper parlor added to the east side, which became the room where evening life happened, where Letitia read and Nelson, mended tack, and James played on the floor with the wooden toys that Ezra Goodnight had taken to carving for him, with the focused attention of a man who had never had grandchildren of his own, but appeared to have found a reasonable substitute. The parlor had a fireplace that Nelson built with the same careful stonework as the original, and above it Letitia hung a small framed document, not a legal document, but a watercolor painting that Clara Abbott had made of the canyon wall at sunrise, a thing of no great technical skill, but of genuine feeling, that showed the rock going from red to gold in the morning light. Nelson looked at it sometimes in the evenings, with his children on the floor and his wife reading beside him and the fire warm and the territory dark and vast outside, and felt the accumulated weight of everything this place had been, and was, the 12 years of solitary work, the morning the notice had been nailed to his gate. The woman who had walked into a borrowed land office with road dust on her hem and a magnifying glass in her hand, and changed the entire course of his life before the sun went down. He said this to her, one evening, when the children were in bed, and the house was quiet, and they were sitting together in the parlor with the fire burning low. "I think about that morning sometimes," he said. "The morning I rode into town, if Hiram had not been ill, if you had not been there." She looked up from her reading. "I think about it too," she said. "I had been in Calico Bend for 3 days. I was wondering whether I had made the right decision to come to this territory." She paused. "And then you walked into that office looking like the ground had been pulled out from under you, and I thought, there is something I can actually do." "You did considerably more than something," he said. She set down her book. "You gave me the case to do it with. Your documentation was the best I had seen in any of the Morrow situations. 12 years of careful records." She looked at him with the expression that was, after 2 years of marriage, still capable of making him feel like the specific morning he had first seen it. "Your father's influence, you said." "He would have liked you very much," Nelson said. "Tell me more about him," she said, settling sideways in her chair in the comfortable way she had in the evenings, her feet tucked up, her book set aside, her full attention given. He told her about his father, the schoolteacher from Ohio, the careful man who had believed that the world was comprehensible if you were patient enough to learn its grammar, who had taught his son to read contracts and keep records and understand that thoroughness was a form of respect. He talked about Ohio, which he had left at 22 and not returned to, though he wrote to his mother until her death in 1878. He talked about the particular quality of his childhood, which had been quiet and principled and somewhat solitary in the way of a scholarly household, and which had, in the end, prepared him perfectly for the solitary work of building a ranch in Arizona, though he had not known it at the time. She listened the way she always listened, with full attention and without hurry, and when he was done she was quiet for a moment and then she said, "He would have liked this life, I think. This particular life." He looked around the room, the firelight, the painting of the canyon, the children's toys pushed to the side, the law books on their shelf alongside the family Bible and the collected almanacs of 12 years, the worn oak table visible through the doorway to the kitchen. "Yes," he said, "I think he would have." The spring of 1886 was fine and warm, with the desert blooming earlier than usual, and Nelson hired a second ranch hand to manage the expanded herd, a man named Rafael Corrales from Sonora, who was the best horseman Nelson had ever seen, and who worked with a calm, steady competence that made the mornings run smooth. James, at 2.5, had developed a serious interest in horses that made early mornings complicated in productive ways, because he would insist on coming to the barn whenever possible and would stand on the rail of the stall with total concentration watching Raphael work with the horses. And Raphael, who was 26 and had younger brothers at home, and knew what a small, concentrated boy needed, taught him the horses' names and the correct way to approach each one. And James applied this information with a gravity that Nelson found difficult to look at directly, without something happening in his chest. Clara, at 1, was a self-possessed and observant child who had not yet arrived at the loud opinion stage, but was clearly organizing her impressions of the world with a thoroughness that suggested she was waiting until she had sufficient data. She had Letitia's gray eyes and Nelson's dark hair, and a quality that both of them recognized as entirely her own, that composed and watchful attentiveness that seemed to take in everything. On a Tuesday evening in May, with the supper cleared and the children in bed, and the last of the spring sunset burning on the canyon rim, Nelson and Letitia sat on the front step of the ranch house, the way they had sat on the front step the evening he had proposed, and the territory lay out before them in the long dusk gold. He had been thinking about something for several weeks and had been waiting for the right moment, which was this moment, or as close to it as a moment could be. "I want to ask you something," he said. "You are going to tell me that you want to be buried here," she said, "on the ranch, not in town." He turned to look at her. "How did you?" "You have been looking at the far ridge in the evenings for about a month," she said, "in a particular way, and you mentioned your father's grave in Ohio last week with a tone that suggested you were thinking about permanence." She paused. "Is that what you were going to say?" "That is exactly what I was going to say," he said. "Yes," she said simply. Yes to burying you on the ridge," she said, "though I intend to be there first if we are doing this properly, given that I am younger." She looked at him with the dry, warm humor that was entirely and specifically hers. "And then you will be buried beside me. And the ridge will overlook the ranch for as long as the ranch stands, which will be for as long as there are Sheridans in this territory, which I intend to be quite some time." He was quiet for a moment, looking at her in the last light. "Letitia," he said. He said her name the way he had been saying it for 2 years, with a particular care, as if it were something worth being precise about. "What?" she said softly. "I am grateful," he said, "every single morning." She took his hand, as she had taken it in the morning light of their first morning together, and held it with the same firm, certain warmth. "So am I," she said. The night came on around them, slow and blue, and the first stars appeared above the canyon rim, and the cattle were quiet in the lower pasture, and the river ran in its unchanging way beyond the fence. The house behind them held the light of the lamp in the parlor, warm through the window, and the sleeping weight of their children, and the accumulated presence of every day they had built together in this place. The ranch was 412 acres along the west bank of the Morales River, in the territory of Arizona, registered in the name of Nelson Sheridan, and it had been so since 1872, and before that in practice since 1870, and it would be so for a long time after this evening. This May dusk. This 2 people sitting on a front step in the last light with the territory spread before them and nothing unresolved, nothing undone, nothing owed that had not been paid with interest. The notice had been nailed to the gate on a Tuesday morning. She had filed the counterclaim before sundown. The land had been kept, the fraud had been exposed, the judge had ruled, And the man who had built the ranch had come to understand in the months and years that followed that what he had nearly lost was not only the land, though the land was irreplaceable, but everything the land might hold, the life that was possible in it. The woman who had ridden out on a bay mare in May and stood at his river and taken off her shoes and put her feet in the cold water and said that her father had loved rivers. He had, he thought, done most things in his life alone and done them adequately and built something real. But this, the ranch as it was now, the children in their beds, the woman beside him in the dusk, this was what the building had been for. He had just not known it until she walked through the door. Letitia leaned her head against his shoulder in the dark, and he put his arm around her, and the canyon was still and the stars were many and the summer was coming in off the high country on a warm wind. And it was, in all the ways that counted, exactly as it should be.